I'm Dan Poole, and I'm going to be talking about the Autism Timing Study. I'm going to be giving a little bit of background to the project and also talking a bit about two studies which we conducted as part of the project, which are complete. Now, you've already heard a little bit of personal experiences from autistic people around time. I'm just going to add two more to further illustrate these differences in timing. These are both available in the wider literature. So we have Donna Williams, who was writing in the 90s, who said, "For me, a problem with sequencing is also about sense of time and the continuity or lack of it in my personal history." More recently, in The Reason I Jump, Naoki Higashida wrote, "Time can only be fixed in memory in the form of visual scenes. For this reason, there is not a lot of difference between 1 second and 24 hours. Now, what we're hearing is we've got a handful of these really profound experiences around timing and time. And as scientists, and we're wanting to try and better understand these experiences, we need to generate hypotheses about what's happening, which we can then go on to test. Now, over the past 20 years, a number of researchers have really developed up this idea, the so-called temporal deficit hypothesis of autism. The idea here is that reduced connectivity between different brain regions in autistic people's brains, so most particularly in the striatum, impact on the functioning of the internal clock. This in turn impacts on the individual's timing abilities. So what I'm referring to here are the kind of things like the perception of duration and event timing. And that this then has an impact on higher order behaviors and thinking around time. So the kinds of things that I've been referring to in these personal experiences and things that we've been hearing about a lot today already, about punctuality, around thinking around time, and general temporal cognition. So we've got this smattering of anecdotal reports, but what research is there that's attempted to bring these together and get a sense of how autistic people feel about their experiences around time and the people around autistic people? Now, you've heard a little earlier today about the It's About Time questionnaire. This questionnaire was originally devised for measuring differences in timing in children with ADHD. It's completed by the child's parent, and there are a number of items on this questionnaire. These items relate to the management of time, and in dark blue there I've given an example of one of these items on the questionnaire. We also have items relating to future and past thinking, and also more general conceptual understanding of time. So to date, there had been 2 studies which had looked at timing in autistic people using the It's About Time questionnaire. And autistic people's parents reported in quite a similar way to that previous research had found from parents of children with ADHD. Autistic children scoring much lower in comparison to non-autistic neurotypical children. Now, I just want to note with these 2 previous studies, so they used relatively smaller samples, so small, not huge numbers of children in each group or parents in each group. And also the age range from sort of 7 to around 16. This is quite wide in terms of sort of developmental milestones. Also recently, David Vogel, working with autistic adults, they used the time experiences questionnaire. This questionnaire uses open-ended questions, and because it's completed by adults themselves, they can offer their own personal reflections on how they think about and feel about time. And there are some example items there in dark blue. Now, because it uses these kinds of open-ended questions, you get this really very rich, what's called qualitative data. Now, I can't capture all of this in just a single slide, but just some sort of highlights from what they found was that autistic adults were reporting a low awareness of the passage of time, and that they were able to support this using structure and routine in their daily lives. The participants also talked extensively about having anxieties when thinking about the future. So this finally brings us to our first study. So our plan in our first study was try and look a little bit more at personal accounts. Here we were looking at parents again, just talking about their children. And we wanted to look at a larger sample than previous work. There's always the danger with small samples that you may have just captured a small number of participants who are describing particular problems. So I was trying to look at casting that a bit more broadly. And also we used a slightly more discrete range of ages, 7 to 12, a particularly important phase in which children learn about time, and also in non-autistic children tend to develop timing abilities. Now, all the children in this study were educated in mainstream school, and they were all based in the UK. And I should note as well that all the participants communicated verbally. Or the children communicated verbally. The parents were describing children who communicated verbally. So the participants completed an online survey. This involved a questionnaire, the It's About Time questionnaire, which we described earlier. And we also had some open-ended questions, which we devised with the Manchester expert group. So the expert group are a group of autistic adults and parents of autistic children, and they helped us figure out questions which would be important around timing in everyday life. So we ended up with items relating to punctuality, awareness of time, and asking about the extent to which time differences actually had an impact on their child's life. Now, all this work has actually just recently been published, and you can read this article for free if you search for the title. Okay, so now just to describe the findings. Now, firstly, there's the reports on the It's About Time questionnaire. Now, I'm going to talk you just through this figure. We're going to see a few figures like this in my presentation. Here we have the It's About Time scores, and these are the scores for the autistic group, neurotypicals, and these are called rain cloud plots. These dots each represent individuals who completed the questionnaire. It's quite difficult to look at these on their own, so the things you might be looking at are the extent to which the bulb of these distributions, so this is like where most of the participants were, the extent to which these overlap between the autistic and the neurotypical participants. And here you can see the scores were quite a lot lower in the autistic group in compared to the neurotypical non-autistic group. So very much repeating the findings from previous work. The next thing was from the open-ended questions, and we were quite struck with the extent to which the parents in the autistic group, in a way that the parents in the neurotypical group were not, were really talking about quite a profound impact on their child's sense of well-being in relation to time. So here are just a couple of sample quotes which I think illustrate this, given in the dark blue. Next, we completed what's an analytical procedure called thematic analysis, which allowed us to identify important themes in the data. Taking all this rich qualitative data and identifying what's important. So there were 3 themes. The first theme was called time knowledge. So this really referred to problems that the parents were describing in their children had with learning about concepts related to time. So the kind of things we're talking about here are about using the clock and also about using units relating to time in an appropriate way. So here we're talking about using units like minutes, hours, weeks, and so on. It was noted that these issues were not in keeping with the child's general educational and mathematical in particular attainment. And the parents talked about different approaches that their child had of sort of managing this and how they dealt with this. So there was a large number of reports that the children had an intense focus on time, reflecting they didn't really understand time properly, and so they were very anxious about it, and they were very concerned about things like their punctuality, but were not able to do much about it. And that's illustrated in this quote here. On the other hand, there were a small number where children were described as just avoiding time, just really not thinking about it and not really caring. Next theme is prospection. So here we're referring to the capacity to think about the future and also about preparing and planning for things that you're going to do. Now, perhaps it won't be too much of a surprise that many parents of autistic children were talking about their children having very fixed plans and fixed sort of like routines, and where these then weren't met, this caused a considerable cause of distress. And there was a sense that this in some respects was related to problems the child may have had about thinking about the future in a more flexible way. Now, related to this, problems with planning were quite widely reported, and parents widely reported extent to which they were supporting their children in order to help them with these problems of planning. So one interesting thing that emerged in this respect was that the effectiveness of aids, which are quite commonly used to support planning in autistic children, so things like visual aids and also the child's routines, the extent to which these were seen to be effective was really quite mixed, with many parents noting that the child actually had to remember their routine, had to remember to look at a visual aid for it to be effective and look at it at an appropriate time. Instead, parents tried to help support their children by really minimizing the amount they had to plan for and giving them as little to do as possible. And that's illustrated by this quote at the bottom here. There was really a strong sense to which parents were describing having to really support their children a lot with this kind of planning, with getting ready. And there was a lot of conflict where parents were talking about feeling quite concerned because they really wanted to help their children to develop this sort of valuable life skill that would enable them to live more independently. But at the same time, they were typically finding themselves under quite a lot of pressure in terms of having to get ready for school, get ready for work themselves, or for other activities which would just tend to require a high amount of punctuality. Now, the final theme is monotropism. So monotropism isn't our own idea. This is something that we've taken from the wider literature. And monotropism is a theory that was principally advanced by Dina Murray, who sadly very recently passed away. And the idea behind monotropism is that autistic people have an attentional style, so a way of focusing on information, whereby their mental processes are focused on a relatively closed range of interests. How this really, we saw this being manifested in the current data was the extent to which time was really shaped by autistic children's interests in a way that it wasn't in neurotypicals. So time was seen by autistic children as being very precious. They really valued their time because they really wanted to be able to spend as much time as they could engaged in their own preferred activities and interests. And so they become quite distressed where this could be disrupted and where people might affect their capacity to do the things that they enjoyed. Another interesting observation was that children were described as becoming much more aware of time when engaged in activities they were interested in. So they'd be monitoring the time while they were doing that activity. This is a little bit counter to the sort of perceived wisdom of really just being immersed, fully immersed in activity. It was instead that children were trying to monitor the time to make sure they could get as much time out of and much pleasure as possible out of those activities. So overall, study 1 really suggests that many autistic children are parents of autistic children are describing a lot of issues relating to time in their children, which are having quite a profound impact on the child and the family as a whole in a way that wasn't described in parents of neurotypical children. Now, we think there are a few implications of this work. So from these kinds of reports, it's quite clear that punctuality can really just cause a lot of distress and anxiety and stress in autistic children. There were descriptions of these children arriving at school, particularly very wound up from the whole process of having to get ready and the rush of getting ready for school in time. Where some greater flexibility was allowed, this would really ameliorate, really reduce the sort of stress and anxiety. There's also an extent to which autistic children may be at a disadvantage whenever completing schoolwork under a time pressure. Now, just returning us to this slide, referring to this so-called temporal deficit hypothesis. Just to remind you that what this hypothesis predicts is that timing is a fundamental problem with the perception and experience of duration, of event timing, these fundamental timing abilities in autistic people. Now, we completed a systematic review. I should say, this was led by my colleague, Dr. Martin Casasus. Completed a systematic review of the existing literature on timing and time perception in autistic people. So a systematic review is where you take all of the existing evidence that's been published on a particular topic, you read all of it, bring it all together, and synthesize it to try and make sense of this current state of the evidence. Now, we heard earlier that there are a number of different types of timing, quite a range of different mental processes involved, and there's quite a need to be specific about what you might be looking at. We found in the existing literature quite a variety of different approaches have been used. Single studies using very different experiments, looking at very different processes, and all claiming to be looking at timing and sort of assessing timing abilities. Now, perhaps reflective of the fact that such a variety of approaches have been used, we found that the evidence base was actually very mixed. There are a number of studies which do support this temporal deficit hypothesis, showing that, that autistic people perform less well on timing tasks compared to neurotypicals. However, there are also a good number of studies that show absolutely no difference between autistic and non-autistic people, and a small number of studies which show autistic people can be superior on some timing tasks. Another interesting observation from the systematic review was there seemed to be some interaction between timing and time and memory. So this in tasks which involve having to hold time, durations in mind, autistic people tended to be more commonly showing reduced performance compared to neurotypicals, and also what's referred to as prospective memory type tasks, which you're going to hear a little bit more about this afternoon. You tend to see more commonly reduced performances on those kinds of tasks than just fundamental timing. Now, in our study 2, what we were aiming to do was try to improve the characterization of timing in autistic people. We were hoping to use a large-scale study using a wide variety of different tasks, looking at a number of different timing processes in the same set of autistic and non-autistic people, in order then that we might identify which particular processes, types of timing might be impacted, and this might help orient towards strategies and interventions that might help support autistic people where they're experiencing issues. So we tested 57 autistic and 91 non-autistic neurotypical adults aged between 18 and 45. All this testing was done pre-COVID, so participants came into the lab at the University of Manchester and they took part in this variety of assessments. These involved making judgments on auditory and visual timing tasks where all of the stimuli were at a millisecond level, super brief timing. We also asked participants to complete some questionnaires about their timing experiences in everyday life. I'm just noting here that the study was pre-registered. This just means that in advance, we completed a document which locked in everything that we were doing and all the analysis we were going to conduct. Now, there were a number of different ways that we thought that performance might go in our autistic group. Now, if the temporal deficit hypothesis is accurate, then autistic people will be expected to perform less well on all the timing tasks compared to non-autistic people. On the other hand, some recent work suggested that it might be that on timing tasks involving judgments about auditory stimuli, autistic people may do less well, but they actually might be better on tasks using visual stimuli. Also, from our review, alternatively rather, from our review, it might be that timing tasks involving memory might be impacted in autistic people. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk you through each task in turn. There are a number of different tasks. I'm just going to talk you through the tasks themselves and then describe the data. Firstly, we have the duration perception task. Very simple task here. Participants just presented with two durations back to back and are asked which of those was longer. What we do then is adjust the difference between those durations until the participant can just about tell the difference between them. This gives us an estimate of what's called their threshold. The lower this is, the better the participant is at this task. The important thing here that we found is that there were no differences in thresholds. These bulbs don't overlap too much between the autistic, they overlap, sorry, a lot between autistic and neurotypical people on both the auditory and visual versions of these tasks. Next was an event timing task. So here, the participant was presented with stimuli in really quick succession. They were asked which of those came first. This is an order judgment task. So again, we have an estimate of threshold, and this is we reduced the gap between them until it was very difficult to determine the order. And again, no differences between the autistic and the neurotypicals on either task. Next, the task's a little more complicated. So this task, which was measuring the function of the internal clock. On this task, the participant is presented with a duration. They're then asked, how long was that? They had to type that out and they saw a wide variety of different durations. We then extract a measure called the slope using what's called a linear regression on all their different estimates. A slope of 1 would mean the participant is performing perfectly on this task. The important thing here is, again, there were no differences between the autistic and neurotypical groups on either the auditory or visual versions of the task. Next, we had a task involving the internal clock, but also memory as well. So the participant was presented with a duration. They were asked to try and hold that in mind. Afterwards, we presented them with different, what's called comparison durations, where they had to say on each one, was that the same as the one that you previously remembered? Here we had a couple of different conditions where the standard was of quite different durations. And it's quite tricky to see because we've got a couple of different conditions here. But overall, the autistic group were a little lower than the neurotypical group on this task, so where memory was implicated. That is that the performance is less good. A prime, higher values of A prime mean the participant is performing better here. Next was something a little different. This is a retrospective timing task. So when the participant came into the lab, we asked them for their phone, their watch, or what have you, and they put it in a basket. Unbeknown to them, I started a timer, and after a set point in the testing procedure, stopped the timer and asked them, how long do you think has passed since I took your phone, watch, what have you? Now here, a score of 0 would mean that the participant is performing perfectly. Their estimate is exactly correct. Lower scores, or more negative scores rather, mean the participant was underestimating the amount of time, and positive mean they were overestimating. An interesting observation here is that participants were tending to underestimate the amount of time, even though they were doing these quite boring experimental tasks. Time was actually flying for them. But the important thing is this was to the same extent for autistic and neurotypical participants. Finally, we asked participants to complete questionnaires about their timing in everyday life. We had the It's About Time questionnaire, which we've already described, measuring time concepts. Autistic participants, much like in children, we reported lower scores on this scale compared to neurotypicals. On the other hand, time structure questionnaire, which measures time structure, the extent to which autistic people, to which people extract meaning from their time and extract value from the things that they do in the day, this has increased in autistic people in comparison to neurotypicals. So there were differences on these questionnaires. There wasn't a deficit in autism. So in summary, study 2, the evidence overall does not support a timing deficit in autism. This is because we didn't see differences between autistic and neurotypical people on most of these different tasks. We did observe differences where the memory was involved, so it might be that rather than any fundamental problem with timing, there's some issue with how timing is encoded or retrieved in memory, and this is something that we need to look at in a bit more depth. We also, as I described, we observed these differences on these questionnaires. So on the It's About Time scale, autistic participants were reporting reduced time management and less conceptual understanding of time, but also increased time structure. They were talking about getting more from their time in the day. Now, interestingly, this scale is negatively correlated with boredom proneness, amongst a couple of other measures. So again, just to highlight that this indicates there are differences in how autistic people relate to time in their daily lives. Just to recap, across the 2 studies and where we're at the project so far, time can be an issue for many autistic people. However, our study suggested that fundamental timing, so the function of the internal clock, may be similar to neurotypical, in adults at least. There are differences in how autistic people interact with time in comparison with neurotypicals. Now, what do we do with this and what should we do next in trying to improve our understanding here? So firstly, we have this difference relating to the internal clock. Yes, we found this in autistic adults. It'd be very valuable to do a similarly thorough, rigorous piece of work in autistic children to try and better characterize these kinds of timing abilities. Also, I note that all these tasks involve making explicit judgments about time. So the participant was told they were going to make some sort of timing judgment. This involves drawing attention to the fact that you're looking at time. What about on implicit tasks where the participant isn't actually told that there's something going on relating to time? And in many ways, these are the kinds of timing tasks perhaps that we do more in our day-to-day lives. Another thought relates to how is timing interacting with executive functioning and the extent to which what we're seeing here are executive functioning differences. Another area that I'd quite like to explore, which is somewhat related to these differences in interests and monotropism that came out of study 1. How does an individual's personal interests or a monotropic sort of cognitive style, how does that really impact and shape timing experiences? And all of this is in service to try and better understand where autistic people are facing challenges relating to time so that we can better target support. I still continue to believe that by better characterizing differences and the underlying processes, that's how we're going to be in a better position to help people. So finally, I want to say thank you, firstly to the study team, Luke Jones, Emma Gowan, Ellen Polikov, and Martin Casasus. I say thank you also to the Autism at Manchester expert group for their advice on our studies and in interpreting the findings. And finally, thank you to all the study participants for taking part and giving up their time for this work. Lastly, thank you to you all for listening.